Again, thanks guys for being here today as we jump into 2 Samuel's chapter 15 and 16. We are in the second section of the book of Samuel. The first section that we went through is David's triumphs. Now we're in the section of David's troubles. And in these two chapters, David's troubles really come to roost through his son Absalom. So let's go ahead and jump to 2 Samuel chapter 15. Let's do our read through and then we'll begin to unpack it. All right, 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 1. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or a case would come to me and I would see that they receive justice." Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him and kiss him. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice. And so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living at Geshur in Aram, I made this vow. If the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron." The king said to him, "Go in peace." So he went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, "As soon as you hear the sound of trumpets, then say, 'Absalom is king in Hebron.'" 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing about the matter. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he also sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gilo, his hometown. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept increasing. A messenger came and told David, "The hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom." Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword." The king's officials answered him, "Your servants are ready to do whatever our lord the king chooses." The king set out and his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So the king set out with all the people following him, and they halted at the edge of the city. All his men marched past him, along with all the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and all the 600 Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath marched before the king. The king said to Ittai, the Gittite, "Why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with King Absalom. You are a foreigner, an exile from your homeland. You came only yesterday, and today shall I make you wander with us when I do not know where I am going? Go back and take your people with you. May the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness." But Ittai replied to the king, "As surely as the Lord lives, as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it be in life or death, there will your servant be." David said to Ittai, "Go ahead, march on." So Ittai the Gittite marched on with all his men and the families that were with him. The whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on toward the wilderness. Zadok was there too, and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the ark of the covenant of God. They set down the ark, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. Then the king said to Zadok, "Take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. But if, he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." The king also said to Zadok the priest, "Do you understand? Go back to the city with my blessing. Take your son Ahimaaz with you, and also Abiathar's son Jonathan. You and Abiathar return with your 2 sons. I will wait at the fords in the wilderness until word comes from you to me." So Zadok and Abiathar took the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem and stayed there. But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too and were weeping as they went up. Now David had been told, "Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom." So David prayed, "Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." When David arrived at the summit where the people used to worship God, Hushai, the Archite, was there to meet him. His robe was torn and dust was on his head. David said to him, "If you go with me, I will be a burden to you. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'Your Majesty, I will be your servant. I was your father's servant in the past, and now I will be your servant,' then you will help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. Won't the priests Zadok and Abiathar be there with you? Tell them anything you hear in the king's palace. Their 2 sons, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, and Jonathan, son of Abiathar, are there with them. Send them to me with anything you hear." So Hushai, David's confidant, arrived at Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city. All right, so that completes the reading of chapter 15. Any thoughts or comments before we start to unpack it?
Hey, Perry, how was David left pretty quickly? I guess it's implicit that Absalom had already gained a lot of military strength, I guess. Just seemed like David left really fast.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that, John, and why it was that that he seemed to leave the city quickly. But yes, it appears that Absalom was a real schemer. And he was also the player of the long game. As we saw in last week's study, when he was scheming to kill Amnon after he raped his sister Tamar, Absalom was willing to wait 2 years to take his revenge out on Amnon and have him killed. So Absalom is, 1, a strategist and a schemer, and 2, like I said, he's willing to wait. He's very patient, and he's willing to wait to play the long game to bring forth his plan. And what we'll see here is that he actually had this plan in the works for about a period of 4 years. Anything else?
He have Job. Didn't he have Job also on his side? Joab.
Yeah.
And he, he is probably the more senior of David's sons at this point. Now Solomon emerges later, but there's not anything. The Bible's silent on what's happening with Solomon at this point. But as far as just seniority, he probably felt like, I should be king anyhow. And I think that's why Joab went with him.
Well, so you're right. Few more things about Absalom. He was very handsome. He was bright and intelligent. And even in David's mind, he was the heir apparent. In the people's minds, he was the heir apparent, and in David's mind, he was the heir apparent if anything should happen to David. And Absalom would have been the next person in line and the next person most ready to step in to be king. And just like you said, Steve, he started thinking about, well, why should I have to wait? You know, why should I have to wait to be king? I think I can. I think I can do this thing. I think I can become king all on my own. It kind of reminded me of the story of Satan. You know, Lucifer being created by God as the most beautiful creation, and then becoming full of himself and thinking, you know what, I too can become God, which caused a revolt in heaven, which God put down, but Lucifer was able to take with him or bring with him a third of the angels, which were all cast to earth. Satan and a third of the angels, which of course are the demons. So likewise, I think Absalom started getting pretty heady about himself. And no doubt, you know, he was listening to people saying, you know, you really ought to be king. And so Absalom enacts his plan, and he is very politically savvy. So as we start to unpack this, it's interesting that this passage starts with, or this chapter starts with, in the course of time, right? So it's telling us that some time has transpired since the end of chapter 14. Again, Absalom is a patient person, and he's willing to play the long game. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and 50 men to run ahead of him. So is this building a military prowess? Well, no doubt that was part of what Absalom was thinking, but he was also starting to act kingly, because only either very wealthy or very important people had an entourage as big as 50 people that went ahead of him. And Absalom wasn't walking, you know, when he went from one place to another. He wasn't walking, he was riding in the chariot, kind of like in the limousine being chauffeured. He was trying to put forth his image of importance. Verse 2, he would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Why? Because business was done at the city gate. If you needed to meet with a person, have a business meeting, a conversation, a discussion, a negotiation, you would meet at the city gates. So this is where Absalom went. This is where the important business took place. So he would get up early and he would stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. So he was catching people before they got there. People were going into the city to do business, to do important things, like, for example, hoping to appear before the king, to bring a grievance or to ask for a judgment. And so Absalom was standing there in the road before the gate, trying to catch these people before they entered the city. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." So what is he doing here? Well, he's starting up a conversation. He's using the question, "What town are you from?" as a conversation starter to get people to talk to him. Because here's this guy. Now, he would have been dressed in finery, but here's this guy standing on the side of the road. And you have no idea what it is that that this person wants or this person needs. So he says to him, you know, "What town are you from?" And it's interesting to see the answer. It says he would answer to the question, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Now, does that seem to you like to not answer the question that was asked? The question was asked, "What town are you from?" And the answer comes back, "From one of the tribes of Israel." But if you recall, each of the tribes were given a portion of the land. And within that land, there were specified hometowns. So by saying which tribe you were from, you were actually answering the question, "What town are you from?" Or what region of the country, what area of the country you're from. So at first blush, it sounds like that they're not answering the question that was asked, but actually they are. By saying which tribe, like tribe of Benjamin, guess what? You know that the hometown is Bethlehem. Oh, okay. All right. Then Absalom would say to him, look, your claims are valid and proper. So this is kind of skipping ahead for us a little bit. Absalom had now started the conversation. Well, why are you here? Why are you coming to Jerusalem? Why are you coming to the capital city today? Oh, we're hoping to see the king. Oh, really? You're hoping to see the king? Well, I hope that goes well for you. What are you here to discuss, or what's your business, if I can ask? And they would say, well, we're hoping to make a claim, or we're hoping to ask the king to make a judgment. We have this dispute with a neighbor, or dispute with a landowner, or whatever the situation was. And then Absalom would say, look, your claims are valid and proper. So he is not necessarily making a judgment, but he is verbally validating, the way that you feel, the way that you think, what you're after, what you seek is valid. But I got bad news for you. The king doesn't have anybody to listen to you. The king is too busy to listen to you, to himself. So I just want to tell you ahead of time, don't get your hopes up that you're going to actually see the king. If you get to see anybody today, it's going to be one of the king's representatives. But I can tell you right now that they're busy too, and that there's going to be nobody to hear your grievance. So now all of a sudden, their hopes are dashed, and they haven't even entered the city yet. But Absalom offers the solution. He says, but here in verse 4, and Absalom would add, if only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or a case would come to me, and I would see that they receive justice. So he's being total politician here. If only I were in charge, if only I was king, or if I was the judge, I would make sure that I would get you justice. I would hear your case. And so by doing this, he was gradually, one person at a time, beginning to win the hearts of the people of Israel. Verse 5, also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. So it didn't matter who they were, right? Absalom was making them feel important. He was making them feel received. He was making them feel listened to. Verse 6, Absalom behaved in this way toward all Israelites who came to the king asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the people of Israel. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, at the end of 4 years, did you get that? Remember, Absalom is willing to play the long game. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living in Geshur in Aram, I made this vow. If the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron. Now, David would have thought that this is strange because Geshur was in Syria to the north. So why in the world would Absalom make a vow to worship God in Hebron when he's living in Geshur? He's in the north, and he makes a vow to worship God in the south, where Hebron is located. And yet, the tabernacle is now in Jerusalem. So what Absalom is actually telling David and asking David doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense. But David goes with it. David goes with it. So Absalom said, while your servant was living in Geshur, remember that he went and lived at Geshur when he left after he orchestrated the death of Amnon. He immediately fled and went to Geshur, which is the town his mother was from. I made this vow, if the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I will worship the Lord in Hebron. Okay. Well, what Absalom is doing is he's creating an excuse to get his father's permission to go to Hebron. It's his plan to go to Hebron to establish his revolt, remember that David used Hebron, or he ruled from Hebron, when he was made king over Judah and Benjamin, before he was made king over the whole nation, all 12 tribes. Hebron was his capital city. Hebron was the place of his palace and throne. So Hebron actually has a history of being a capital city in the region. So it makes sense in Absalom's mind that that's, if he's going to establish his own capital, if he's going to establish his own throne, well, where is a better place to do it than in Hebron? So he's orchestrated or concocted this whole story to get permission to go to Hebron. Now, why would he need permission to go to Hebron? And the answer is because David's the king, and it doesn't matter how old Absalom may have been. You know, he's probably in his 30s at this point. So he's not a young guy, and he still has to ask his father for permission to go someplace. I thought that it was interesting that my wife and I were watching the TV series The Crown on Netflix right now, which is very good, and it's really the retelling of the royals from about the from Queen Elizabeth's coronation right up through. I mean, right now we're in the period of time where Diana and Charles were recently divorced, and Diana has just met Dodi Al-Fayed. But what was interesting was that Diana wanted to take her sons to go on a vacation trip at Mohammed Fayed's invitation to Saint-Tropez. And she had to ask the queen for permission to go. So not an uncommon thing in royal families to have to, as adults, ask permission, because you don't know what else is going on. You know, like, for example, you know, if there was a war that was being planned, or a battle, or some sort of military action, the king would know and nobody else would know about these plans. So maybe it's not a good time to go to that location. That sort of justifies, or not justifies, but explains the need to get clearance from the king or from dad to make a trip, even when you're an adult. So David responds to him. The king said to him, verse 9, "Go in peace." So he went to Hebron. So David gave his blessing to make for Absalom to make this trip to Hebron. Verse 10, "Then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, 'As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, then say, Absalom is the king in Hebron.'" So Absalom's been working on this plan for a while, right? Because he is sending word to his emissaries within the 12 tribes. He's been building a power base for a while. In any kingdom, there are going to be people that are disgruntled and unhappy. It would be very unusual in any kingdom for everyone to be happy with the current administration. Absalom just has to find those people and create a network that forms for him this power base from which he can springboard from at the proper moment, at the proper time. And now his plan, his base is made, his power base has been created, and now he's ready to start to enact his plan, but it requires him to get to Hebron to begin it. Then Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, "As soon as you hear the sound of trumpets, then say, Absalom is king in Hebron." Right? So now you would have two kings, and what's this going to do? This is going to cause a revolt, and Absalom is absolutely planning a coup against his father David. 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. The interesting thing about these 200 men is they were not in on the plan, at least not at this point. But no doubt Absalom invited these particular 200 men himself. So he handpicked them, and even though they didn't know anything of the plan, he thought that they would be loyal to him once they get to Hebron, and he launched his plan. 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests and were quite innocently, knowing nothing about the matter. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he also sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gilo, his hometown. Absalom is going to try and bring Ahithophel, David's chief counselor, in line with Absalom's plan. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing. So people were listening to Absalom, and they were willing to side with Absalom in his plan to revolt against his father. Verse 13. A messenger came and told David, "The hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom." That was probably shocking news to David. If he didn't know before about Absalom scheming for the throne, now he knows about it. Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, so all those that were still with him and in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword." So this answers John's question from earlier. Why was it that it seemed like David left Jerusalem quickly? I think there's multiple reasons here. One is that I think that David, even though he'd been tipped off to Absalom's plan, he doesn't at this point have good intel to know how broad a power base he has and how many generals or soldiers might follow Absalom. And he loves the city of Jerusalem. And he loves his son Absalom. And I think he's trying to avert a war, that he would rather give up Jerusalem to Absalom than for the battle to come to Jerusalem to destroy the city and potentially destroy his son if the revolt would be put down by violent means and Absalom would be killed. So one way to avoid that is to just leave, to just go. And David says, we must leave immediately or he will move quickly to overtake us. So he will bring the battle to Jerusalem and bring ruin on us and put the city to the sword. Verse 15, the king's officials answered him, "Your servants are ready to do whatever our lord the king chooses." So his officials are with him. Whatever it is that David decides to do, they are there to support him. Verse 16, the king set out with his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. This turns out to be an important point. Now, why would David leave 10 of his wives behind to run the palace? Well, again, David loved the city and he loved his palace that had been built for him. And if he could do anything to protect his house, he was going to do that. Now, if he left men behind, they would most likely be killed because they would be a threat. But women are not threatening, at least not in this view, not at this time. So the reason to leave 10 wives behind is to protect the palace, and they're likely not to be killed because they're no threat. But again, this is an important point. Remember that it was David who said to leave 10 of his concubines behind to take care of the palace. Verse 17. So the king set out with all the people following him, and they halted at the edge of the city. All his men marched past him, along with all the Kerethites and the Pelethites, and all 600 Gittites who had accompanied him from Gath marched before him, before the king. All right, what is this all talking about? The Kerethites and Pelethites, they were mercenaries that worked for David. So they could have gone either way. They could have, if the money was right, supported Absalom or supported David. But they're here with David, and they said, look, it doesn't matter. The money is immaterial. We're here with you. We're throwing our lot with you. We believe that you are the rightful king of Israel. And then there was 600 Gittites who came from Gath. So these were Philistines who probably aligned themselves with David, David being familiar with the city of Gath, right? Because he lived there for 7 years, right? And so they were also emissaries or actually mercenaries that worked for David. They were with him as well. So David had a substantial number of men, and he's still deciding to leave the city. Verse 19. The king said to Ittai, the Gittite, "Why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with your king Absalom. You are a foreigner and an exile from your homeland. You came only yesterday, and today shall I make you wander with us when I do not know where I am going?" The Gittites, or Ittai here, the Gittite, when David says you came here only yesterday, this is figurative speech. But what he's saying is it wasn't a literal yesterday, the day before today. You haven't been here very long, and yet I'm going to ask you to wander with us and potentially put your life on the line. That makes no sense. Absalom will have no quarrel with you. You're a foreigner. You don't have anything to do with this. You should go back to Jerusalem. You shouldn't be on the run with us. I have no idea where we're going. Verse 20, you came only yesterday, and today shall I make you wander about with us when I do not know where I am going? Go back and take your people with you. May the Lord show you kindness and faithfulness. But Ittai said to the king, as surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servants be. David said to Ittai, go ahead, march on. So Ittai and the Gittite marched on with all his men and families that were with him. So Ittai and the Gittites were also with David. The whole countryside wept aloud as the people passed by. So there's this whole parade of David's people that are leaving the city, and the people are standing there, the whole countryside, it says, and they wept aloud as the people passed by. They knew that something terrible was happening. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on towards the wilderness. If you've been to the city of Jerusalem, you'll know that there's the old city, and then on the edge of the old city is the Temple Mount, and then on the other side of Temple Mount is the Kidron Valley. And at the bottom of the Kidron Valley is the Kidron Creek or Kidron Stream. I mean, it's not really, can't be classified as a river because it's not much water. But it's a demarcation point. It kind of laid out the outer boundary of the city. So for David to cross the Kidron meant that he was officially leaving the city. And once you leave the Kidron Valley, once you step across the Kidron River, you start going up in elevation and walking up towards the Mount of Olives. Verse 24. Zadok was there too, and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the Ark of the Covenant. So everybody was packed up and ready to leave, including the priests with the Ark of the Covenant. They set down the ark, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. Abiathar is trying to bless their retreat from the city. They're leaving from the city, praying for God's protection. Verse 25. Then the king said to Zadok the high priest, take the ark of God back into the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he will bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. And if he says, I am not pleased with you, then I am ready to let him do to me whatever seems good to him. So David realizes that what he's experiencing now, having to leave the city, and his son raising up a revolt against him, has everything to do with God punishing David for his sins. And David has reconciled himself to this situation, and he's now ready to accept whatever it is that God may do to him. The king also said to Zadok the priest, do you understand? Go back to the city with my blessing. The king also said to Zadok the priest, do you understand? Go back to the city with my blessing. Take your son Ahimaaz with you, and also Abiathar's son Jonathan. At this time, there were two high priests, Zadok and Abiathar. And from what we glean from here, they kind of co-led as the high priests or chief priests at that time. Each of them had a son, Ahimaaz and Abiathar, son Jonathan. You and Abiathar return with your 2 sons. I will wait at the fjords or fords in the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. When David says, I'll wait for you at the fords in the wilderness, we think that he is saying that he'll wait for him on the southern edge of the Dead Sea. So that would have been the fords. If you walk up the Mount of Olives and back down the other side, and you generally follow the Kidron Valley to the north, I believe it is, you'll run right into the Dead Sea. You'll run through En-Gedi and then the Dead Sea. So that's the direction that that David is heading. But he says, I will wait at the fords in the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. So Zadok and Abiathar took the ark of God back to Jerusalem and stayed there, because David knows that the proper place for the ark is no longer in the wilderness. This is not a new Exodus starting, or it's not a new period of time where the Ark of the Covenant needs to wander around the wilderness. It now has a home in Jerusalem. David has built a tabernacle, not a temple yet, but a tabernacle. That's the proper home for the Ark of God, and that's what David wants Zadok and Abiathar to do, to take the Ark home. In other words, the Ark is what happens to the Ark was more important to David than what happens to him, to David himself. But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered, and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up. So they are in mourning. Obviously, it's not a happy moment. They are sad that they're having to leave the city of Jerusalem, especially under these circumstances. And David and the people, they are mourning and weeping. Now, David had told Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. So David prayed, "O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness," so that Absalom would have no advantage by Ahithophel's advice. Verse 32, when David arrived at the summit where people used to worship God, Hushai the Archite was there to meet him. His robe was torn, and dust was on his head. So he too was mourning. He understood the gravity of the situation. David said to him, "If you go with me, you will be a burden to me." Now, why would David tell him that? We think it's likely because he was old, he was aged, and he wouldn't have been able to keep up with the rest of the people. But if you return to the city and you say to Absalom, "I will be your servant, O king. I was your father's servant in the past, but now I will be your servant," then you will help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. Why? Because he's setting him up to be a spy. So this man is a servant of David, and he's still loyal to David. But David is asking him to be a plant in Absalom's court, so that he can glean information that might help hinder Ahithophel. Won't the priests Zadok and Abiathar be there with you? Tell them anything you hear in the king's palace. Their 2 sons, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, and Jonathan, son of Abiathar, are there with them. Send them to me with anything that you hear. So David is very quickly establishing a spy network in Jerusalem. So David's friend Hushai arrived at Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city. So that's how close Absalom was on the heels of his father. So just as Hushai got back to the city, Absalom was entering the city. And of course, Absalom wouldn't know what he would find there, if he would find resistance, if David would have, established the Jerusalem as a fortress, which was a naturally defended city anyway, at least on three sides. So he didn't know what he was going to find there. And when Absalom entered the city, he found that David and most of his supporters had left. They were gone. All right, thoughts, comments before we move on to chapter 16?
Great. I love the fact that even though David knows that this is the Lord addressing all of his sin with him, that he is still, to me, he's doing really thoughtful things for the Israelites of Jerusalem. He's telling them, get out. I don't want you guys to be killed. I don't know what's going to happen. He's picking out specific groups and say, love you, but you may be better off with the other guys. And just it seems like very outwardly focused things versus inwardly focused things. So I just, kind of a big comparison to Saul in our prayer books. But anyhow, just an observation.
Yeah, no, very good observation. So I think David is definitely humbled by this situation, these circumstances, and he makes no allusion to thinking that it's happening for any other reason than it's part of God's judgment on David. Right. And yet he continues to be a leader, and he's thinking of others before himself. So that's a very good observation. Chapter 16. When David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of we were saying it last week, Mephibosheth's, there we go, Mephibosheth's, waiting to meet him. So if you'll remember, Ziba had been the servant of Saul, and he was the one that told David that there was a family member of Saul still alive. And that, of course, was the son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth. And so Ziba is meeting him. Now, the reason that Ziba would have met him was because Ziba was willing to be loyal to David. And David gives him a mission. He says he had so Ziba arrives not empty-handed, mind you. Again, he is wanting to pledge his loyalty to David in this circumstance. And he arrives with a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. The king asked Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, and bread and fruit for the men to eat, and the wine is to refresh those who have become exhausted in the desert." So I should continue with the read through instead of starting to unpack it. So let me go ahead and continue to read through the end of the chapter. Then the king asked, "Where is your master's grandson?" Ziba said to him, "He is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom." Then the king said to Ziba, "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." "I humbly bow," Ziba said. "May I find favor in your eyes, my lord the king." Verse 5. As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family, came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gerza, and he cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones. Though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left, as he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you man of blood, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has handed the kingdom over to your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a man of blood. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. But the king said, What do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? Zeruiah. There we go. Aya. If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, Curse David, who can ask, Why do you do this? David then said to Abishai and all his officials, My son, who is my own flesh, is trying to take my life. How much more than this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse, for the Lord has told him, It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I am receiving today. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. The king and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself. Verse 15. Meanwhile, Absalom and all his men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Then Hushai, the Archite, David's friend, went to Absalom and said to him, Long live the king, long live the king. And Absalom asked Hushai, Is this the love you show your friend? Why don't you go to your friends? Hushai said to Absalom, No, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people and by all these men of Israel, his I will be, and I will remain with him. Furthermore, whom shall I serve? Should I not serve the son just as I served your father? So I will serve you. Absalom said to Ahithophel, Give us your advice. What should we do? Ahithophel answered, Lie with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now, in those days, the advice of Ahithophel, the advice he gave, was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. All right, that's the end of chapter 16. All right, let's go back and let's start to unpack this in the time that we have remaining. So I have to make this a little quick here. So David had gone but a short distance beyond the summit, and there was Ziba. So Ziba, if you recall, was Saul's servant. And he, like I said, he was the one who told David that there was a descendant of Saul still alive, Jonathan's son. Mephibosheth was the one who was crippled. He had the 2 lame feet and had been put in hiding because that was feared that David would have him killed if he knew that he was a descendant of Saul. And Ziba was one of the people that was hiding him. Instead of, and when David found out about Mephibosheth, instead of having him killed or doing something bad to him, he instead takes him in as his own son. And he appoints Ziba to be his servant. And all of Ziba's family became his servant. And Ziba's family was to work the land that belonged to Saul that David returned to Mephibosheth to provide an income for Mephibosheth. So David had really taken care of him. But it's interesting that as soon as um, Mephibosheth heard about this revolt, he decided to stay in the city of Jerusalem because he thought that maybe this would mean the return of the royal family or the kingdom to Saul or Saul's family, and he would be the rightful heir. So he had it completely wrong. He didn't see that Absalom was trying to set himself up as king. He thought that the object was to get David out of being king, and that this would be an opportunity where Saul's kingdom would return to him. And but Ziba it's interesting. He like I said, he doesn't arrive empty-handed. You know, he comes with a string of donkeys. He comes with 200 loaves of bread and 100 cakes of raisins and 100 cakes of figs and a skin of wine. It's also interesting that when David asks him what's the donkeys for, he says that they're for the king's household to ride on. So Ziba, being a lifetime servant, realizes that the servants in David's household will be made to walk. So she's bringing the donkeys as a provision for the servants of David so that they wouldn't have to walk the entire distance if they were traveling. All right, the other interesting feature, because we're running out of time here, is the advice that comes from Ahithophel. And what Ahithophel is telling Absalom once he arrives in the city and he finds the palace empty, but for 10 of David's wives who we left to take care of the household. Ahithophel's advice is, you need to sleep with your father's wives, because this will prove to everyone who sees that you are in command, that you are in control, and you've taken over what belonged to your father. Turn with me to 2 Samuel. So we're in the same book, chapter 12, and we're headed to verse 11. So 2 Samuel, chapter 12, just a few before, and we're headed to verse 11. This is what the Lord says, out of your own household I am going to bring calamity upon you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, so David's sin was in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel. Absalom fulfilled this prophecy that was delivered through the prophet Nate. So Absalom fulfilled this prophecy that God gave to David about what pain was going to come through David's own household. And, I'm sure in David's mind, he weighed those words, but it would have been hard to understand, A, what they meant, and B, if they were going to be fulfilled, how they would be fulfilled. And who would have thought of the circumstances of David's own son forming a revolt, gaining strength, marching in on Jerusalem, finding the 10 wives that David left behind, and then in broad daylight, and to everybody's knowledge, he goes in and he sleeps with them, fulfilling that prophecy. So another interesting feature of both of these chapters is that, as we talked before, David is under no false illusion. David understands that what he's experiencing is the judgment of God on the sins that he committed. And not just any sin, but taking not his wife, taking what didn't belong to him. When he had lots of wives, he took another man's wife and then he had him killed. And so David had blood in his hands. And this guy, Shimei, right? I mean, here's all of David, soldier, his entourage, all of these people marching out of the city, and he decides he's going to kick dirt and throw stones at everyone, right? And he says that David is a bloody man. Well, he was from Saul's family. And so He was aware of all the skullduggery that David had done. He knew about David's sins. And we don't know that God told Shimei to do this, but David says, what if? What if he's working under God's direction? Who am I to stop him? Don't cut off his head. Let him throw stones. Again, this speaks to David's humility at this point and his acceptance about what's going on, and understanding that he is currently suffering from God's judgment. Closing thoughts, comments?
This is great, Perry. Thank you for your teaching.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. It's quite a drama, really, isn't it?
It's theatrical. I really could see this in a movie, don't you think?
I was just going to say this is a story made for TV.
Pretty much.
Thanks, Barry.
All right,
Barry.
gentlemen. Please
Jimmy
have a
just
good rest
come in.
of your week and go with God.
You too. Bye-bye.